Imagine walking into a high-end restaurant expecting nothing more than a quiet dinner. But instead, you're treated like you don't belong, just because of how you look. Now, what if the person who faced that discrimination wasn't just any customer, but the very hot owners of the restaurant? What happens next will shock you and change everything you thought you knew about respect, power, and revenge. It was a quiet Thursday evening when Jasmine entered the upscale restaurant, her steps confident as she walked through the polished glass doors. The warm lights from the chandeliers above reflected off the shiny floors, creating a soft glow across the entire dining room. She was dressed casually in a simple dress and a light jacket, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. From the moment she stepped inside, the atmosphere seemed to shift. A few heads turned, but only for a moment, their eyes quickly darting away as they went back to their meals and conversations. She was used to it by now. As a woman of color, she had learned that people often made assumptions, especially in places like this, where the crowd was overwhelmingly white and dressed in the finest of attire. She didn't let it bother her. After all, she had seen enough of this type of thing before, especially in this very restaurant. Jasmine knew exactly what she was getting into when she decided to stop by. She walked up to the hostess stand where a young man stood, looking slightly disinterested, as though he had seen one too many customers tonight. He gave her a quick glance, his eyes scanning her outfit. She caught the look, the subtle up and down assessment, the brief hesitation before he spoke. "Table for one?" he asked, his voice flat, barely looking at her as he typed into the system. She nodded with a polite smile, trying to ignore the feeling of being judged even before she could say a word. "Right this way," he mumbled, and without another glance, he motioned for her to follow him. As they walked toward a table in the far corner of the restaurant, Jasmine noticed a few heads turn in her direction again. She could tell they were whispering among themselves. She had been here enough times to recognize the looks. She wasn't part of their world, not really. She didn't belong in a place like this. But none of that bothered her, at least not on the surface. When they reached the table, the waiter pulled out the chair for her with a slightly forced gesture, his hands lingering on the back of the chair just a moment too long. Jasmine took a seat, her posture straight, giving him a polite nod. As he turned to leave, she couldn't help but notice the slight sneer on his face. He didn't think she belonged here, she could tell. It wasn't in his words or actions, but in the way he carried himself, the way he looked at her, as if questioning her very presence. She'd encountered it before, but it was always subtle, always hidden beneath layers of fake politeness and forced civility. In this world, being an outsider was a quiet thing. It wasn't always loud or in your face. Sometimes it was just a look, a glance, a whisper that hung in the air just long enough for you to feel it sting. Jasmine was used to it. But as she sat there waiting for the menu, a small part of her couldn't help but feel the injustice of it. She had worked hard to build something of her own. She had struggled through doors that had been closed in her face and had fought her way to this point. No one knew her story, not here. To them, she was just another woman walking into a high-end restaurant, probably looking for a handout or some sort of charity. They didn't know who she was or what she had built. They didn't know that the very restaurant she was sitting in was hers. Her company. She was the owner. But that was something they would never know. Not yet. Not until the time was right. As she glanced around the restaurant, she saw the polished faces of the diners, the well-dressed men and women with their expensive suits and pristine shoes. They all seemed so sure of themselves, so self-assured. She noticed a couple of them glancing at her again, whispering, no doubt making judgments about her presence. Jasmine didn't care. She had been judged all her life. This was nothing new. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that she was about to turn everything they thought they knew upside down. The waiter returned moments later, holding a small tray with a glass of water and a folded napkin. His face was still impassive, but there was a noticeable shift in his demeanor as he placed the glass in front of her with a little more force than necessary. "I'll be back with your menu in a moment," he said, his voice cold. Jasmine gave him a polite smile, nodding slightly in acknowledgement. She could tell he was already sizing her up again, and it didn't take a genius to figure out that he wasn't exactly thrilled about serving her. Jasmine's mind drifted as she sat back in her chair, letting her eyes wander across the room. She had always been proud of the restaurant. It had been her dream to own a place like this, to offer people not just great food, but a welcoming, inclusive atmosphere where anyone could walk in and feel like they belonged. But watching the way people treated her, the way they looked at her as though she didn't deserve to be there, made her question how far things had really come. It was hard to ignore the sneers, the quiet whispers, the glances that seemed to judge her every move. She had built this place, and yet sometimes it felt as though she was still fighting for a seat at the table, as if no matter how hard she worked, how much she achieved, people still saw her through the lens of her race. Her thoughts were interrupted when the waiter returned, holding the menu. He dropped it onto the table in front of her without a word, his eyes scanning the room as if he couldn't wait to get away from her. His attitude was grating, but Jasmine kept her expression neutral, even as she felt the heat of his disregard. She picked up the menu, scanning the options, but her mind wasn't really on the food. She could feel his eyes on her, and the longer he lingered, the more she could tell he was waiting for something, maybe for her to say something, maybe for her to leave. But Jasmine wasn't going anywhere. She was a guest just like anyone else. And despite what he thought, she had just as much right to be there as anyone in the room. She folded the menu, placed it on the table, and looked up at him. His expression faltered for a brief second when their eyes met, but he quickly recovered, masking it with a fake smile. "Is everything all right so far?" he asked, his voice dripping with insincerity. "Everything's fine," Jasmine replied, her tone even and calm. She didn't let the disdain in his voice affect her. She knew exactly what he was thinking, that she didn't belong here. He didn't know who she was, and that was exactly how she wanted it, for now. She wanted to see how he treated people when he thought they were beneath him. She had seen it all before, the subtle looks, the half-hidden judgment, the way people thought they were better than others because of their position or their money. But Jasmine wasn't one to play into those expectations. No, she was here for a reason, and it was time to let the night unfold. The waiter seemed to hesitate for a moment, clearly unsure of what to do. The polite smile he had forced onto his face was beginning to falter, and Jasmine could see the small cracks starting to appear. She didn't push it. She wasn't interested in confrontation, at least not yet. For now, she was content to let him make his assumptions, to let him believe that he was in control of the situation, because he wasn't. Not by a long shot. As Jasmine sat there, her eyes drifted to the other tables. The soft hum of conversation and clinking silverware filled the air, but it did little to mask the tension she felt from the waiter's presence. She could see the other diners, all impeccably dressed, engaging in polite conversation, their laughter echoing softly across the room. Their eyes briefly landed on her now and then, but it wasn't the kind of curiosity that one might expect. It was the kind of glance that said, "What is she doing here?" The same question that had followed her through her entire life. Always the outsider, always the one who didn't quite fit in. Jasmine let out a quiet sigh, pushing the discomfort aside. It wasn't new. It wasn't even unexpected. She had long since learned that people would often make assumptions about her based on her appearance, assuming she was just another woman who didn't belong in places like this. But this time, it felt different. She wasn't just any woman. She was the woman who owned this place. And she would make sure they learned that. Her train of thought was interrupted when the waiter returned with a new set of silverware, his steps quick as if eager to be done with his task. He set the silverware down a little too forcefully, the clink of metal against the table, echoing louder than necessary. He didn't look at her as he did it. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the napkin, his eyes still darting around the room. Jasmine's gaze never left him, watching the way he carried himself, the subtle discomfort in his movements. It wasn't hard to read. He was trying hard not to acknowledge her, trying to distance himself from the very person he was supposed to be serving. "Anything else I can get for you?" he asked, his tone now tight, the edge of impatience creeping into his voice. His attempts at politeness were growing thinner by the second, and Jasmine could feel it. She knew he was waiting for her to speak, for her to give him a reason to leave, to justify his actions. But she wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. She smiled softly, keeping her voice steady. "No, I'm fine for now, thank you." He nodded curtly, but before he could turn and walk away, she caught a glimpse of the expression on his face. There it was again, the judgment, the sense that she wasn't worthy of his attention, much less his service. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And for a moment, Jasmine felt a flicker of anger rise in her chest, but she suppressed it, reminding herself that she was in control of this situation. Her emotions wouldn't get the better of her. Not today. The waiter turned and walked off, and Jasmine sat back in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked around the room. It was so easy to feel invisible in a place like this, so easy to slip into the background and let people assume you didn't matter. But Jasmine wasn't going to let that happen. She had earned her place here. She had earned every bit of it. And while the people around her might not know who she wasn't going to let them define her. They would find out soon enough. Jasmine leaned back, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of the table. This wasn't just about a meal, not anymore. This was about something much bigger, about showing them what it meant to underestimate her, about making them realize that they had no idea who they were dealing with. It was about turning their assumptions on their heads and watching them scramble to pick up the pieces. The night was far from over, and Jasmine was just getting started. The waiter continued to avoid eye contact, but Jasmine noticed him keeping an eye on her from the corner of his vision. It was almost like he couldn't help himself, despite his best attempts at pretending she wasn't there. As the evening wore on, the subtle tension in the air grew thicker, and Jasmine could feel it. She could feel the eyes of the other diners on her too, and it was no longer just a casual glance, it was a judgment. The kind that wasn't spoken aloud, but was carried in the silence between words and in the uncomfortable shifting of people's eyes. Jasmine had been in enough high-end restaurants to know how people acted when they assumed they were in the company of someone who didn't belong. It wasn't always direct. It wasn't always loud. But it was there, in the way people held their drinks a little tighter, in the way they suddenly became overly focused on their own conversations, as though trying to avoid looking her way. And the waiter, well, he seemed to be the one leading the charge. It didn't bother her the way it might have bothered someone else. She had long since learned that she couldn't change how people saw her, especially not in a world that was still so wrapped up in appearances. But she also knew this wasn't just about her. This wasn't just about her race or her place in this space. It was about the culture she had built, the legacy she had created with her own hands. And watching the way people assumed she didn't deserve to be here made her blood boil just a little. The waiter returned once again, but this time his attitude was even more obvious. He didn't walk with his usual speed. Instead, he dragged his feet, giving the distinct impression that he was irritated by the very thought of serving her. He didn't bother with pleasantries this time. "You ready to order?" His voice was sharp, dismissive, as though he had already decided what the answer would be before she even spoke. Jasmine looked up at him, her expression unchanged. "I'm not quite sure yet. I'm still deciding." Her calm demeanor only seemed to make him more uncomfortable, his posture shifting as he stood there waiting. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, obviously eager to be gone. Jasmine could see the impatience in his eyes. But she wasn't in a rush. She wasn't going anywhere. She could feel his disdain hanging in the air, and yet she remained poised. She had been taught how to handle people like this. She had learned over the years how to navigate situations where others underestimated her, how to stand tall in the face of judgment, and how to wait for the right moment to turn everything around. As the minutes dragged on, Jasmine's mind began to wander, but this time it wasn't just the frustration of being ignored. She was starting to think about how she would handle this. She knew she could confront him, call him out for his behavior, or even leave and take her business elsewhere. But no, she had bigger plans. She wasn't just here to eat dinner. She was here to prove a point that he and the others in this restaurant would never forget. And soon enough, they would understand just who they were dealing with. The waiter hovered for a few moments, clearly growing more restless as Jasmine continued to sit in silence, pretending to scan the menu with genuine interest. But his discomfort was palpable, and she could almost feel him wishing she would just make her decision and move on. It was like he couldn't wait to be done with her, to get back to serving the people he thought deserved his attention. Jasmine knew exactly what he was thinking. He assumed she was just another woman, probably new to places like this, someone who would never be able to afford the luxury of a full meal, or someone who would leave without even giving a decent tip. She could see it in his body language, the crossed arms, the quick glances at the other tables, his impatience seeping through. It wasn't just the way he treated her, it was the way he assumed he could treat her like this and get away with it. And the more he acted this way, the more Jasmine's resolve solidified. Finally, the waiter gave a long, exasperated sigh, as if her decision to take her time was some great inconvenience. He made no attempt to hide his irritation anymore. "Well, if you're not ready, just let me know when you are," he said, turning on his heel, eager to be rid of her. His voice was sharp now, carrying an edge of dismissiveness that was hard to ignore. Jasmine let him walk away without a word. She could feel the anger bubbling inside her, but she knew this wasn't the moment to show it. Not yet. She had made up her mind about how she would handle this, and it would take a lot more than his rudeness to throw her off course. She sat back in her chair, folding the menu neatly and placing it back on the table. She wasn't hungry anymore. She wasn't interested in food. She was interested in one thing, making him see who she really was. She had spent her entire life building an empire, breaking down barriers, fighting against expectations. People had underestimated her for years. They still did. The waiter, still trying to keep up appearances, went to another table to attend to his other customers. Jasmine noticed how he was all smiles and courteous laughter now, his earlier disdain seemingly forgotten. He was a different person when he was talking to others, more relaxed, more pleasant. But Jasmine knew better. She could see the way he acted when he thought she was just another face in the crowd, someone who didn't matter enough to be treated with respect. And she made a mental note of every interaction, every glance, every word. She didn't move from her seat. Instead, she scanned the room again, this time noticing more of the little details. The way the other staff moved around, the way the guests interacted with one another, all so polished, so calculated. It was a world built on appearances, a world where she didn't fit in, not in their eyes. But Jasmine wasn't here to fit in. She was here to turn everything upside down, to show them that the person they had dismissed so easily was, in fact, the one who owned it all. And when the time was right, she would make sure they knew just who they had been dealing with. The evening seemed to drag on in slow motion, the quiet buzz of the restaurant amplifying each time the waiter passed her table. Jasmine could feel the eyes of the other diners on her, but this time it was different. The glances weren't just brief, they lingered. She could almost hear their silent judgments, the unspoken assumptions about who she was and why she was here. They all thought they knew her story. They thought she was just another customer, a woman who had wandered into the wrong place by mistake, someone out of place in this world of wealth and refinement. It didn't help that the waiter continued to avoid her gaze, only speaking when absolutely necessary. Each time he came back to her table, he seemed more annoyed. He offered no apologies for his earlier attitude, no attempt to make up for his rude behavior. Instead, he just went through the motions, delivering the same impersonal service he would give anyone he thought wasn't important. Jasmine could feel the air in the restaurant thickening, charged with an undercurrent of judgment, but it only made her more resolute. She wasn't here to make a scene. She wasn't here to force anyone to respect her. No, she was here to let the truth speak for itself. And the truth was simple. She was the one in control. As the waiter returned once again to check in, Jasmine sat up a little straighter in her chair. This time, she noticed a small tremor in his hand as he reached for the water glass. He was trying hard to hide it, but she could see it. She could see how uncomfortable he was now, that his assumptions were starting to crumble. Jasmine knew that deep down, he was starting to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake, but he was too proud to admit it. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, his tone still clipped, though there was a slight shift. It was less condescending now, more neutral. Jasmine let the silence hang for a moment before responding. "I'm fine," she said softly, her voice calm and steady. "But I'd like to speak with the manager." The waiter hesitated, caught off guard by the request. He had expected her to either leave or keep her head down, to simply accept the poor service and fade into the background. Instead, she was asking for the manager. His discomfort grew, and he hesitated for a long moment before nodding stiffly. "Sure, I'll get him." As he turned to walk away, Jasmine couldn't help but smile inwardly. She wasn't sure if the manager would even be able to do anything, but she wasn't doing this for them. She was doing this for herself, and for the quiet, invisible women like her who had walked into places like this and been treated as though they didn't belong. This moment wasn't just about showing him who she was, it was about showing herself that she could stand her ground, that she could rise above this moment and take control of her narrative. She knew the waiter was already regretting his actions, but that wasn't enough. Regret didn't undo the damage he had done. The real lesson would come soon enough, and Jasmine knew it would be one he wouldn't forget. The waiter walked off briskly, his steps quickening as if he were trying to distance himself from the situation. Jasmine didn't move. She remained in her seat, calm and collected, watching him disappear into the back of the restaurant. It was almost too easy to predict his reaction. She could see the gears turning in his mind, no doubt wondering what had prompted her to ask for the manager. Was she going to cause a scene? Was she unhappy with the food? Or perhaps he was wondering just how much longer he could avoid dealing with her. But Jasmine wasn't there for any of those reasons. She wasn't angry. She wasn't upset. She was simply going to show him and everyone else in the room that there were consequences to treating people like they didn't matter. She had seen it before, countless times. People like him, assuming that just because someone looked different or dressed differently, they didn't deserve the same respect. But what they didn't know was that Jasmine had earned everything she had. She didn't need to prove her worth to anyone. And tonight, she wasn't going to let this waiter walk away thinking he had gotten the best of her. Minutes passed, and soon the waiter reappeared, this time with a slightly older man in tow, presumably the manager. The man was dressed in a sharp suit, his hair neatly combed, and his face set in a professional expression. He walked with purpose, his steps confident, but when he saw Jasmine sitting there, his eyes flickered with a hint of hesitation. The waiter stood beside him, arms crossed, his face still trying to maintain an air of calm, but it was clear he was uncomfortable. "Good evening, ma'am," the manager said, his voice polite but tinged with a touch of formality. He gave her a quick once-over, as though sizing her up before speaking. "I understand there's a concern you wanted to discuss with me." Jasmine kept her expression neutral, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She could feel the weight of the moment in the air, the tension building as the two men stood before her. She could tell the waiter was hoping she would back down, that she would let the moment pass. But she wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. "Yes," Jasmine began, her voice calm, but with an edge of authority that made both men pause. "I'd like to address the service I've received tonight." The manager nodded, but there was an underlying impatience in his eyes, as though he was already preparing for the inevitable complaint. "Of course, I'm very sorry if there's been any issue. We always strive to provide excellent service." Jasmine let that last part hang in the air for a moment before responding. "I understand, but I don't think excellent service is what I've received tonight. In fact, I think I've been treated with disrespect, and I believe that's something that needs to be addressed." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. The manager's eyes flickered to the waiter, who was now visibly sweating, his hands nervously shifting at his sides. Jasmine's gaze didn't leave the manager. She wasn't going to let them dismiss her concerns. The manager blinked, clearly caught off guard by her directness. "I see. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" he asked, now more attentive, though his tone was still tinged with caution. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. "Well, for one, I was treated with indifference the moment I walked in. I could see the judgment in the waiter's eyes. The cold attitude, the rushed service, it was all very apparent. He assumed I didn't belong here." The manager's eyes widened slightly, and he turned to the waiter, his brow furrowing. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice shifting, now laced with concern. The waiter shifted uncomfortably under the manager's gaze, but didn't answer right away. Jasmine kept her gaze fixed on the waiter, her voice calm but piercing. "You assumed that because I wasn't dressed the way you expected, I didn't have the right to be here. But what you didn't know, what neither of you knew, is that I own this place." There was a long pause. The waiter's eyes widened, and for the first time that night, his arrogance faltered. The manager looked between them, his face a mix of confusion and realization. Jasmine sat back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest, allowing the weight of her words to settle in. The silence stretched, and Jasmine knew that the moment of truth had arrived. The manager stood frozen for a moment, his eyes darting between Jasmine and the waiter, his mind clearly struggling to process what she had just said. The waiter's face had drained of color, and he fidgeted uncomfortably, clearly not knowing how to react. Jasmine could see the shift in both of them, the realization that the woman they had so easily dismissed was not just some random diner. She wasn't just another woman who didn't belong in this world. She was the very person who owned the world they had so casually assumed belonged to them. Jasmine didn't speak right away, allowing the tension to build, watching as their expressions transformed from disbelief to nervous realization. Finally, the manager cleared his throat, his voice now tinged with a nervous edge. I didn't realize," he stammered, glancing at the waiter for some sort of confirmation. But the waiter remained silent, his hands now shaking, as he tried to regain his composure. "I can see that," Jasmine replied, her tone smooth but carrying an undeniable authority. "I own this restaurant. I built it from the ground up, and I'm the one who ensures that every guest who walks through that door is treated with respect, no matter who they are. But tonight, that respect was absent." Her words seemed to land heavily in the air, each syllable filled with an undeniable weight. The manager's eyes widened, clearly unsure of what to do next. He had assumed she was just another ordinary diner, someone he could treat however he wanted. But now, the reality had hit him like a ton of bricks. I am so sorry," the manager stuttered, his voice shaking slightly as he tried to offer an apology. I wasn't aware of what had happened, but I assure you this will not happen again." He turned to the waiter, who was now looking down at the floor, his face red with embarrassment. "You'll need to apologize as well, immediately." Jasmine watched them both closely, her eyes hardening as the waiter slowly lifted his gaze, clearly struggling with the embarrassment of the situation. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, his words barely audible. "I didn't mean to. I just thought—" Jasmine cut him off, her voice calm but unyielding. "You thought I didn't belong here because of how I looked, didn't you?" The waiter's face flushed even more, his eyes flickering with guilt. He nodded reluctantly, his discomfort clear. Jasmine's expression didn't change. "You assumed my worth based on my appearance, and because of that, you treated me like I was invisible, like I didn't matter." The waiter opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His apology felt hollow now, knowing that Jasmine was seeing through it all. He had thought he was in control, that his assumptions about her were the reality. But now it was clear that he had underestimated the wrong person. Jasmine stood up from her chair slowly, her movements deliberate. "Let me be clear," she said, her voice carrying across the now silent room. "This isn't just about an apology. This is about respect. You don't get to decide who belongs here based on their race, their clothes, or their appearance. We all deserve to be treated with dignity, no exceptions. And that means that actions have consequences." The manager opened his mouth again, but this time Jasmine didn't give him the chance to finish. She knew what was coming next. The waiter was about to beg for forgiveness, the manager was about to offer empty reassurances, but Jasmine had heard it all before. The system was broken. It wasn't enough to ask for apologies. It wasn't enough to hope for change. No, there needed to be real consequences. "I'm afraid," Jasmine said, her tone unwavering, "that your actions tonight will have consequences. You've made assumptions about the people you serve, and because of that, you've made this place unsafe for everyone. You're fired." The words hit the room like a shock wave. The waiter's face went white as his eyes widened in disbelief. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The manager stood motionless, unable to believe what he was hearing. He had expected to smooth things over, to make excuses, but instead, Jasmine had just flipped the script entirely. The man who thought he was in control, the one who had judged her, was now the one who was losing everything. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her gaze didn't waver as she turned to the manager. "And you for allowing this kind of behavior to go unchecked? You're fired as well." There was no hesitation in her voice, no second thoughts. She was done playing games, and the reality was sinking in for both of them. What they had assumed about her, that she was just another nameless face in their restaurant, someone they could dismiss without consequence, had been completely wrong. The silence in the room was almost suffocating. The words, "You're fired," hung in the air, reverberating off the polished walls, as if the entire restaurant had frozen in place. Jasmine's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the shock on the faces of the manager and the waiter. The realization of what had just happened was slow to settle in, but when it did, the weight of it was undeniable. The waiter's face was pale now, his eyes darting nervously between the manager and Jasmine, his hands trembling at his sides. He had been too confident earlier, too sure that his assumptions about who she was would go unnoticed. Now it was all coming crashing down around him. The manager, still in shock, finally found his voice, but it came out shaky, barely above a whisper. You can't be serious," he stammered, his eyes flickering to the waiter for some kind of support, but there was none. "I am serious," Jasmine said, her voice unwavering. She took a step toward the waiter, her eyes locked onto his. "You thought you could treat me this way because I didn't fit the image you expected, but the truth is you had no idea who I was, and now you'll have to face the consequences of that ignorance." The waiter opened his mouth to speak, but Jasmine held up a hand, silencing him before he could form any words. He stood there, helpless, as if the reality of his situation hadn't fully registered yet. His arrogance, his dismissiveness, all of it had been wiped away in an instant. Jasmine wasn't here to offer mercy. She wasn't here to soothe his guilt. She was here to teach him a lesson about respect. She turned back to the manager, whose face had gone a shade of red as he tried to salvage the situation. I don't care how long you've been here or how many times you've managed things before, Jasmine said, her voice growing colder. This kind of behavior won't be tolerated in my restaurant. You've allowed it to fester, and now you're part of the problem. The manager's hands clenched into fists, but he didn't respond. He knew deep down that Jasmine was right. This wasn't about just one bad employee, it was about a culture that had allowed such behavior to go unchecked for far too long. Jasmine wasn't just firing them for how they had treated her. She was firing them because they represented everything that was wrong with a system that judged people based on their appearance, their race, or their perceived place in the world. Both of you, Jasmine continued, her voice cutting through the silence, have shown me that you don't understand what it means to respect others. And now you'll both face the consequences. Your time here is over. The waiter's face was a mix of confusion, anger, and disbelief. He had expected to continue serving tables, continuing his career as if nothing had happened. But now his world had turned upside down. His mouth opened and closed as he searched for the right words, but nothing came out. Jasmine stood still, watching him with a calm intensity. She wasn't gloating, she wasn't basking in the power she now held, but she wasn't going to let this moment pass without making sure the lesson was learned, not just by the waiter or the manager, but by anyone else who might think they could get away with similar behavior. "Leave," she said simply, her tone final. The waiter didn't hesitate anymore. He turned quickly, his feet stumbling as he made his way toward the back of the restaurant. The manager followed suit, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As they disappeared into the back, Jasmine remained standing at the center of the room, her gaze unwavering. The room, still filled with a sense of shock, began to stir. Whispers floated through the air, the tension from earlier replaced by a growing sense of realization among the diners. Jasmine was the owner of this place, the woman who had been mistreated, the one who had been underestimated, and now she was in control. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. The lesson had been taught, but it wasn't over yet. This was just the beginning. Jasmine stood there for a moment, letting the reality of what had just unfolded settle around her. The shock in the room was palpable, the whispers now growing louder, but she didn't mind. She had expected this reaction, the uncomfortable tension, the confusion, the disbelief. These people, her customers, her staff, had no idea who she truly was, and now they were learning the hard way. As she took a step back toward her table, the murmurs of the other diners grew more noticeable. They had witnessed everything. They had watched as the waiter and manager were called out, exposed for their prejudice and arrogance. They had seen how easily Jasmine had taken control, how quickly she had turned the tables on those who thought they could get away with mistreating her. And now they were left to process it. They had seen what true authority looked like, and it wasn't in the hands of those they had thought were in charge. Jasmine sat back down, her posture relaxed, yet commanding. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't upset. She had done what needed to be done. The waiter and the manager had learned their lesson, but this wasn't just about them. It was about setting a precedent. It was about making sure that everyone, from the staff to the guests, knew that there was one rule in her restaurant: respect. The room slowly quieted down as the last of the whispers died out. A few eyes lingered on her, but she didn't acknowledge them. She didn't need to. They were starting to understand. Jasmine had already shown them the power of dignity and control. Now, it was time for the real shift to happen. Moments later, a young woman from the back of the restaurant approached her table. She was one of the waitstaff, her face tentative as she stepped forward. Jasmine recognized her as someone who had been quietly working in the background, never drawing attention to herself, but she had always seemed kind, always smiled when she passed by. Unlike the others, she hadn't given Jasmine the look of judgment, hadn't assumed she didn't belong. This woman was different. Jasmine looked up at her with a slight nod. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone soft but inviting. The young woman hesitated before speaking, her voice quiet. "I just wanted to say, I saw what happened, and I wanted to thank you for standing up for yourself and for standing up for everyone." She paused, her eyes meeting Jasmine's, sincerity clear in her expression. "I know what it's like sometimes to feel invisible, but you showed us all something tonight." Jasmine smiled slightly, her heart warming at the woman's words. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. "But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. We deserve to be treated with respect, no matter where we come from, what we wear, or the color of our skin." The young woman nodded, her eyes bright with understanding. "I won't forget this, and I'll do my part to make sure it never happens again." Jasmine's gaze softened as she stood up. She was proud of this woman, proud of how she had responded to the situation, how she had chosen to stand on the right side of things. "I appreciate that," she said, giving the woman a warm, encouraging smile. "And that's exactly what we need. We need more people to speak up, to stand up for what's right, no matter how uncomfortable it might be." The young woman's face lit up with a shy smile before she turned and walked back toward the kitchen, leaving Jasmine to sit in the growing stillness of the restaurant. Jasmine took a deep breath, looking around at the remaining patrons. The mood had shifted, the power had shifted, and she had no doubt that from this moment forward, things would be different here. No one would ever again assume they could treat anyone with disrespect, not in her restaurant and not in her world. She had set the tone, and now it was time to let it sink in. People would remember this night, remember how one woman had stepped up and changed everything. As the evening wore on, the rest of the diners finished their meals, some of them casting curious glances in her direction, others still processing what had happened. But Jasmine wasn't focused on them anymore. She was focused on the future where respect wasn't just a word, but a rule that everyone followed, whether they liked it or not. And as she left the restaurant that night, her heart light and her head held high, she knew that the world she was building was only just beginning. The following days at the restaurant were noticeably different. Word had spread quickly about what had happened. The incident, as shocking as it had been in the moment, had sparked a shift in the atmosphere. Staff members who had once walked around with an air of casual indifference now seemed more aware, more cautious of their behavior, and more respectful of the guests they served. It wasn't just the employees who had felt the change, it was the guests too. The tone in the room had subtly altered, as if everyone had suddenly realized that this was a space where things like respect, fairness, and dignity mattered. Jasmine walked through the restaurant each day, taking note of the small but significant changes. The once distant staff now greeted her with genuine warmth, their smiles a little brighter, their conversations with her a little more respectful. They had seen her step up and take control, and in doing so, she had set a new standard. It wasn't something that could be ignored or brushed aside. They had witnessed firsthand what happened when someone with power took a stand, and it made them reevaluate their own actions. A few days after the firing, Jasmine was sitting at a table near the window, sipping on a cup of coffee, as she watched the restaurant come to life with the lunchtime crowd. She was lost in thought, reflecting on everything that had transpired. She knew the decision to fire the waiter and manager had been harsh, but it had been necessary. Sometimes actions spoke louder than words, and she had wanted to send a clear message that prejudice and disrespect would not be tolerated under any circumstances. Her reverie was interrupted when Linda, the young woman who had thanked her after the incident, approached her table. Linda was one of the newer employees, but Jasmine had noticed her work ethic and her quiet dedication. She had always seemed to stay out of the drama, focusing on her job without getting involved in the petty behaviors that sometimes ran through the restaurant. Jasmine had respected that about her. "Excuse me, Jasmine," Linda said, her voice a little unsure but sincere. Jasmine looked up and smiled at her, gesturing for her to sit down. "Hi, Linda. How are you?" Jasmine asked, setting down her cup of coffee. "I'm good, thank you," Linda replied, her hands clasped in front of her as she nervously stood. "I just wanted to say, I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I just wanted to thank you again. I know you didn't have to do what you did, but you did it anyway, and it's made a big difference." Jasmine raised an eyebrow, surprised by the depth of Linda's words. She'd expected a brief thank you, but not this. "I'm glad you think so," Jasmine said gently, her gaze softening. "It wasn't about doing the right thing for me. It was about doing the right thing for all of us." Linda nodded, her expression serious now. "That's exactly it. I've seen so many people walk into this restaurant and get treated like they don't belong here, and I've always just stayed quiet, done my job, and tried not to make waves. But after what happened, I realized I was just letting it happen, even when I saw it." Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her voice firm but kind. "Sometimes speaking up doesn't feel easy, Linda. It takes courage, but you don't have to stand by and let others be treated poorly. If you see something wrong, you can be the one to make it right." Linda smiled faintly, her expression more confident now. "I want to be that person," she said, determination settling in her features. "I don't want to just stay quiet anymore. I want to stand up for the right thing." Jasmine's heart swelled with pride. She had seen in Linda the potential for change, the quiet strength to make a difference. In that moment, Jasmine realized something that she hadn't fully processed before. Her actions hadn't just changed the atmosphere in the restaurant, they had inspired others. Linda wasn't the only one who had been moved by what had happened. People were waking up to the idea that they had a responsibility to stand against injustice, no matter how small the act of defiance seemed. "Good," Jasmine said, her voice filled with conviction. "That's exactly what we need. More people who are willing to speak up and make this place a better, fairer place for everyone." Linda's face lit up, a sense of purpose gleaming in her eyes. "Thank you, Jasmine," she said. "You don't know how much this means to me." Jasmine smiled warmly, her thoughts shifting. She had done more than just take back control of her restaurant. She had planted the seed for something bigger. Linda wasn't the only one who had been inspired. The ripple effect of Jasmine's actions was spreading far beyond that night. She had set a new standard, and slowly it was being embraced by those who worked for her, as well as the guests who dined in her establishment. She knew there was still more work to be done. There would always be more work. But tonight, as she watched Linda walk away, her shoulders a little higher, her step a little more confident, Jasmine felt a sense of accomplishment. She was changing the world, one step at a time, and that was only just the beginning. The change that Jasmine had hoped for began to take root, not just in the restaurant, but in the conversations that surrounded it. Word had spread beyond the walls of the establishment. People were talking about what had happened, and opinions were mixed. Some praised her for taking a stand, for showing the world that actions had consequences, and for demonstrating that power could be wielded with dignity and responsibility. Others, of course, had more critical views, but Jasmine didn't mind. The restaurant was no longer just a business. It was a symbol of change, a statement that would echo far beyond the plates of food served to customers. One evening, as Jasmine was sitting in her office, reviewing some new plans for the restaurant's expansion, her phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from Linda. "Jasmine, can you come out to the front for a minute? There's someone here who wants to speak with you." Jasmine raised an eyebrow, intrigued. She put her paperwork aside and walked out into the main dining area. As she stepped out, her gaze landed on a man standing near the entrance, his posture tense, his arms crossed. He was dressed in a suit, his expression serious but not unfriendly. "Hello," he said, his voice deep but calm as Jasmine approached. "I'm Thomas Holloway. I'm the editor for the City Gazette." Jasmine paused, trying to recall if she had ever heard of the paper. She didn't recognize the name, but given the seriousness of the man's tone, She figured this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. "Nice to meet you," she said, her tone polite but cautious. "What can I do for you, Mr. Holloway?" "I'm sure you've heard by now about what happened here a few days ago," he said, his eyes searching hers for a reaction. Jasmine nodded but didn't speak, letting him continue. "I wanted to speak with you about it. Your actions have garnered some attention, and I think there's more to your story than just a simple case of customer service. I think it's a story that needs to be told." Jasmine felt a knot form in her stomach. She had expected the incident to get some attention, but she hadn't anticipated it reaching the press. "What kind of story are you looking to tell?" she asked, still maintaining her calm exterior. "Your story," Holloway said, his eyes studying her with an intensity that made her feel both exposed and intrigued. "The way you took control of the situation, the message you sent with your actions. There's a bigger narrative here about race, respect, power, and how people in positions like yours can shape the culture of a company. I think people would want to hear about how you took a stand, not just for yourself, but for everyone who's ever been treated unfairly." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She had never intended for the situation to snowball into anything bigger than a simple act of standing up for herself. But now, as she stood before this man, realizing the potential impact of her actions, she understood that this was more than just a story about a rude waiter. This was about something much larger, about the way people treated each other, the prejudices that festered in quiet corners, and how the power of one voice could challenge an entire system. "I wasn't thinking about a story," Jasmine replied after a pause. "I was thinking about what was right. I wanted to make sure that this was a place where everyone could feel safe, where no one had to tolerate disrespect, no matter who they were." Holloway nodded, impressed by her words. "That's exactly why I think this is important. People need to hear your perspective, not just the surface-level details of the incident. They need to understand the ripple effect that one person's actions can have, how it can change a culture, even a whole company." Jasmine's mind raced. She had never thought of herself as a symbol for change, but now, standing before this man, she began to understand the bigger picture. She had already changed her restaurant. But if she took this opportunity to share her story, perhaps she could help others realize that they too had the power to make a difference. "You really think people would be interested in hearing about it?" she asked, her voice laced with curiosity. "I know they would," Holloway said firmly. "It's a powerful message, one that challenges the status quo, and right now, the world could use more of that. It might not change everything overnight, but it would make people think. And sometimes that's all it takes, getting people to think." Jasmine took a deep breath, weighing her options. She hadn't set out to make waves, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that maybe she had a responsibility to share her experience. Not just for her, but for the countless others who had been in her shoes, people who had been ignored, underestimated, and treated like they didn't matter. After a moment, she nodded. "Okay, let's do it." Holloway smiled, a hint of approval in his expression. "I'll set up an interview with you. We'll talk more about the details, and I'll make sure it's a piece that truly reflects what happened. Your story deserves to be told." As he left the restaurant, Jasmine stood by the door, watching him walk away. A part of her was nervous about how the story would be received, but another part of her felt empowered. She had already taken a step toward changing her world, and now, it seemed, the opportunity had come to take that next step. She had started this journey by standing up to one person, but now it seemed that her voice was going to reach much farther than she had ever imagined. The interview was scheduled for the following week, and in the days leading up to it, Jasmine couldn't shake the mix of anticipation and anxiety. She wasn't nervous about speaking her truth. That was something she had done before, in quieter, more personal moments. But now her words would be reaching a larger audience. She would be telling her story to the world, sharing the experience that had started with one rude waiter and grown into something much bigger than she could have ever expected. On the day of the interview, Jasmine arrived at the restaurant early, wanting to ensure everything was in order before the press arrived. She ran through her usual routine, checking the kitchen, speaking with her staff, reviewing the plans for the evening, but her mind was on the interview. She was more aware of the way people looked at her now, and it was strange, almost surreal, to think that in just a few short hours, her story would be shared with thousands, maybe even millions. When Holloway arrived with his camera crew, Jasmine felt a quiet sense of resolve settle over her. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to shy away from it. She was going to speak the truth, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. She had already made an impact within her own restaurant, but this was bigger. As Holloway and his team set up, Jasmine took a deep breath and reminded herself why she was doing this. She wasn't doing it for fame or recognition. She was doing it because she knew that stories like hers needed to be told. She wanted people to understand that the power of one voice could shift the culture of a place, of a company, of an entire community. People needed to see that standing up for what's right was never easy, but it was always worth it. The interview began, and Holloway's first question was simple. "Jasmine, thank you for agreeing to speak with us today. Can you tell us what happened the night that changed everything?" Jasmine nodded, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of passion. "That night, I walked into my restaurant like I always do, expecting to have a quiet evening. But what happened next was anything but quiet. A waiter treated me with disrespect. He assumed I didn't belong there because of how I looked, and for a second, I thought about just letting it go. But then I realized I couldn't. Not when I knew that what was happening wasn't just an isolated incident. It was bigger than that." As she spoke, her mind drifted back to that night. The coldness in the waiter's eyes, the dismissive attitude, the way she had been made to feel invisible. She had never expected to find herself in a situation like that, but when it happened, she knew she had to act. She couldn't let it slide. Not this time. "I could have walked away, taken the treatment, and kept quiet," Jasmine continued. "But that's not the message I wanted to send. I wanted to show everyone that disrespect isn't something you tolerate. Not in your business, not in your life, not anywhere. And I knew that if I didn't stand up for myself, I wouldn't be standing up for anyone else either." Holloway nodded, clearly impressed by her conviction. "And after you stood up for yourself, you didn't just stop there. You fired the waiter and the manager. That's a pretty bold move. Why did you feel that was necessary?" Jasmine paused, gathering her thoughts before responding. "I didn't just fire them for how they treated me. I fired them because their actions reflected a culture that had been allowed to fester. They thought they could get away with treating someone poorly, and that kind of behavior needed to be addressed. If you want to change the culture of a company, you have to set the example. And sometimes that means making tough decisions." Her words were simple but powerful, and Jasmine could feel the weight of them as they hung in the air. This wasn't just about a single incident anymore. This was about making sure no one else was ever made to feel the way she had felt that night. "You were setting a standard," Holloway said thoughtfully, "a standard of respect. Do you think that's something businesses, and even society at large, struggle with?" Jasmine nodded, her expression serious. "Absolutely. It's easy to dismiss people, to judge them based on how they look or where they come from. But we're all human. We all deserve respect, no matter who we are. Businesses, society, they need to understand that treating people fairly isn't just the right thing to do, it's the only way to build something that lasts. And if we don't start holding ourselves accountable, then nothing will ever change." Holloway looked at her for a moment, taking in her words. "It sounds like this incident turned into something far greater than you ever expected." Jasmine smiled, a faint but knowing smile. "I didn't plan for it to be anything more than standing up for what was right. But now I realize it's about creating change, not just for myself, but for everyone who's ever been made to feel less than. This isn't just my story, it's everyone's story." As the interview wrapped up, Holloway expressed his gratitude for Jasmine's honesty and openness. The crew packed up their equipment, and Jasmine stood in the middle of the restaurant, letting everything she had said sink in. It had felt good to speak her truth, to let others hear her story and understand the reason behind her actions. But as the last of the crew made their way out, Jasmine's mind couldn't help but race. She had opened a door, and there was no closing it now. The story would be out there for the world to see. She had known, of course, that her actions would stir up reactions, but now she felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Her decision to stand up to the waiter and the manager had been difficult, but it had been the right one. And now, as she stood alone in the restaurant, she realized the true impact of what she had done. She hadn't just changed her restaurant. She had sparked a conversation about respect, dignity, and what it means to treat others as equals. Later that evening, as she sat down to dinner in the quiet restaurant, she thought about the future. She had always been driven by the idea of creating something that mattered, something that could make a difference. But tonight, she understood that the difference wasn't just in the food she served or the business she ran. It was in the way she treated people, in the way she set an example, and in the way she stood up for what was right. Jasmine smiled to herself, her heart at ease. The story had just begun, and she had no intention of letting it end here. The world was listening now, and as the restaurant doors closed for the night, she knew that the real change had only just started. The days that followed the interview were a whirlwind. The City Gazette article was published a few days after the interview, and, as expected, it caught the attention of many. The headline read, "Restaurant Owner Takes a Stand, How One Woman's Bold Action is Changing Corporate Culture." The article detailed Jasmine's decision to fire the waiter and manager, explaining the reasoning behind her actions and the lessons that could be learned from her story. The piece didn't shy away from addressing the broader issue of workplace discrimination, but it also highlighted the strength and resolve Jasmine had shown in taking control of her business. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from all over, some from people who had been in similar situations, others from business owners who admired her bravery. Jasmine's social media accounts were flooded with comments ranging from praise to criticism, but the majority were overwhelmingly positive. People shared their own stories of workplace discrimination, of being treated unfairly because of how they looked or where they came from. It became clear that Jasmine's actions had resonated with more than just her employees and customers. They had struck a chord with a much larger audience. Jasmine wasn't used to this level of attention, but as she read through the messages, she felt something she hadn't anticipated: pride. Not pride in the recognition, but pride in knowing that she had inspired others to take action in their own lives. She had shown that one voice could indeed make a difference, and the ripple effect was evident in the stories people were sharing. One particular message stood out to her. It was from a woman named Carla, who had worked in a corporate job for years, but had always felt overlooked and dismissed because of her race. After reading about Jasmine's experience, Carla wrote that she had finally found the courage to speak up about the microaggressions she had endured at work. She had sent an email to her supervisor outlining the ways she felt marginalized, and it had sparked a discussion in the company about diversity and inclusion. Carla ended the message by thanking Jasmine for giving her the strength to demand the respect she deserved. Reading that message made Jasmine realize just how powerful her actions had been. She had started something that wasn't just about her restaurant or her business. It was about challenging the system, about forcing people to confront the discrimination that often goes unchecked, whether in the workplace or in everyday life. Jasmine smiled as she closed her laptop, feeling a sense of fulfillment that had eluded her for so long. She had never imagined that standing up for herself would lead to this kind of change. But now, she understood that every step she took had the potential to create a ripple effect, and the change she had started was far from over. As the weeks went by, Jasmine noticed subtle but meaningful shifts in the culture of her restaurant. Staff members were more engaged with the guests, offering a level of warmth and respect that hadn't always been there before. The mood was lighter, more positive, as if a weight had been lifted from the collective shoulders of the employees. They felt empowered, inspired by Jasmine's leadership, and that energy translated into better service, better teamwork, and a renewed sense of pride in the work they did. The guests, too, began to notice the change. They commented on how friendly and attentive the staff seemed, how welcoming the atmosphere had become. It was clear that the restaurant was no longer just a place to dine. It had become a space where respect was valued above all else. Jasmine could feel the difference in the way people interacted with each other, in the way the energy in the room shifted from transactional to genuine. One afternoon, as she was walking through the dining area, she noticed two of her staff members talking quietly in the corner. They stopped talking when they saw her approach, but Jasmine could tell that they had something on their minds. She smiled at them, encouraging them to speak. "Jasmine," one of the waiters, Tim, said hesitantly, "I just wanted to thank you for what you did. I've worked here for a while, and honestly, I never realized how much we were letting slide. I've seen the way people are treated sometimes, and I always just brushed it off, thinking it was just the way things were. But what you did, it made me realize we don't have to just accept things as they are. We can make them better." Jasmine's heart warmed at his words. She had never set out to change the world, but she was starting to realize that sometimes change happened in unexpected ways. She had sparked something in her employees, a sense of accountability that had been missing before. "It's not always easy, Tim," Jasmine said, her voice calm and reassuring, "but it's worth it. Standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable, is how we create a space where everyone feels valued. It's how we build a culture of respect." Tim nodded, a small but genuine smile on his face. "I get that now, and I think everyone else does too. It's different here now. We're different." Jasmine felt a sense of pride fill her chest. Her restaurant was no longer just a place to eat. It had become a place where people felt seen, where they could take pride in their work and know that their voices mattered. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, Jasmine felt confident that the culture she had worked so hard to build was moving in the right direction. As she looked around the room, she saw more than just employees serving food and customers enjoying their meals. She saw a community, a group of people, each one deserving of respect and dignity, coming together to create something better than it had ever been before. And in that moment, Jasmine knew that the change she had sparked was only the beginning. As time passed, Jasmine's restaurant continued to thrive, but it was no longer just about the food or the service. The heart of her business had transformed. The culture of respect she had worked so hard to build had become a model for others to follow. And it wasn't just about creating a better environment for her employees. It was about creating a space where everyone, regardless of who they were, could walk in and feel valued. The impact went beyond the walls of her restaurant. Other local businesses began reaching out, asking Jasmine to share her experience, to offer advice on how they, too, could cultivate a more inclusive and respectful workplace. Jasmine started hosting small workshops for other business owners, teaching them how to recognize and address bias, how to foster an environment where all employees felt empowered to speak up and take pride in their work. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of challenges along the way, but Jasmine knew it was worth it. The lessons she had learned in the heat of that moment, the decision to take a stand, the courage to hold people accountable, were lessons that needed to be passed on. One evening, after one of her workshops, a business owner came up to her and said, I've been running my business for years, but I've never thought about things the way you've put them. I've never realized how much we tolerate behind closed doors, how much we let slide under the guise of normal. What you've taught me today is going to change how I run my business from now on." "Thank you," Jasmine smiled softly, her heart swelling with pride. It wasn't about accolades or recognition. It was about knowing that her story had inspired others to take action, that her experience had created a ripple effect that was extending far beyond what she could have ever imagined. But even as she expanded her influence, Jasmine knew that the journey was far from over. The restaurant was thriving, yes, but she still had to fight every day to keep the culture she had built intact. She knew that change wasn't something that could be taken for granted. It was something that had to be nurtured, protected, and constantly reinforced. Every conversation with an employee, every interaction with a guest, was an opportunity to reaffirm the values she held dear. And as the restaurant grew and more opportunities came her way, Jasmine remained steadfast in her mission to create a world where everyone felt they had a place, where respect was non-negotiable, and where no one was ever made to feel invisible. A year after the incident with the waiter and the manager, Jasmine stood at the front of her restaurant, watching the evening crowd flow in. The energy in the room was different now. There was a sense of unity, of belonging, that hadn't been there before. The staff were engaged, the guests were comfortable, and the entire atmosphere felt like something special. It was no longer just about a meal or a night out. It was about a community coming together to share in something bigger than themselves. Jasmine's phone buzzed, interrupting her moment of reflection. It was a message from Linda, one of her longest-serving employees, the young woman who had initially thanked her for standing up to the waiter. Linda had risen through the ranks, and now she was managing a team of her own. "Hey, Jasmine, I just wanted to let you know that we've been receiving more positive feedback than ever before. People are noticing the change in the restaurant, and it's clear they appreciate the effort we've put in. I think you've really started something here. You've made this place something more than just a restaurant. You've made it a place where people feel like they belong." Jasmine smiled to herself as she read the message. It wasn't just about the success of her business, it was about something deeper. The restaurant had become a symbol of change, a place where everyone was treated with dignity, where the lessons learned from that one pivotal moment had created a ripple effect that was still spreading. As the evening progressed, Jasmine took a step back and looked around at her restaurant, her creation, her dream, her legacy. She had started this journey by standing up for herself, but in doing so, she had created a place where others could stand up too. It had been a tough road, but Jasmine had learned something invaluable along the way. Change doesn't come from waiting for the world to improve on its own. It comes from the courage to take action, to challenge the status quo, and to make the kind of world you want to live in. Jasmine had set out to make a difference, and in doing so, she had transformed her world, one small decision at a time. And she knew with certainty that the work wasn't over yet. There was still more to be done, but for the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be.